This is the abstract. It really says that what Cuba is, it's been a 6-year self-funded development, and it's a little bit of passion behind building this thing. It's a truly decentralised web services engine, and what I want to do is probably go over the way we thought about this and why we thought about it and what we've actually included in the way of information systems design. And is it one at the top for the next bit? Which is the bloody buttons on this next? Right. Must be too old. I say, after decades of experience with military, telcos, big banks, US, you name it, all around the planet, my mum in her village in the UK, isolated. No broadband, literally no broadband. Arthritic fingers, shoulders, bad ankle, weather, couldn't talk to the neighbour next door hardly, the phone was the devil. And most of the technology around her, in fact, was just an intimidation. The washing machine, I needed a science degree, so I threw it out. I got another one with wash and stop on it. So when you start looking at aged, the issue of carers coming in, doctors coming in, maintenance people coming in as they do in villages, fire doors, you name it. The whole lifestyle was about compression. There was not one decision she could make in terms of how do I get my carer here tomorrow when it's raining or snowing? Who do I talk to Mrs. Smith for tomorrow to look after my dog or something? So part of what I'm saying, through no thought of her own, it was really quite depressing. She eventually got dementia. But the process is not about transactions. The process is about interactions. The carer, the doctor, the operator oversight in the village, me as a family member, my sister to get transport. And all of that was the confusion point. And you try and do that with lots of websites and mobile phones when you've got bad fingers, it's no fun at all. So this is the problem space that aged people face, regardless of what people say they've all got mobile phones is. And you need about 30 or 40 websites to support your lifestyle. Different terms and conditions, different passwords, different rules of billing, different this, different that, font sizes, accessibility features. It's shambolic. It's awful. And so part of what Cuba was about is how do I build a web services engine with an accessible web services interface that mum could talk to a neighbour up the road with a video call when it was snowing, without the internet, with Wi-Fi. How do I build a social cell where she could relate to doctors and carers, family and friends, operator oversight, get help when she needs it, without the internet? So let's design a social cell where it's scalable. And part of that design, which I'll go through here, was the address book. And it's amazing, always amazing to me when we talk of identity, but the identity we have is in the context of the people we're relating to and why. It's not a barcode, it's not a serial number or a driving licence. It's, I need to talk to my doctor like this, he needs to know it's me. I need to talk to my carer like that, my carer needs to know me. So we've got context and interactions and identity issues about how do I know you? Are you just a friend or are you my doctor? Are you my carer or my daughter? So part of the address book design was put in what we call role class hierarchy, because we can say you are my doctor or doctors, you are my grandson, you are my carer. And then when you look at the way people try and find things, as I mentioned here, is that mum used to write things on the fridge or on the calendar and then say, I don't know my doctor's number anymore. It's quite horrible. So part of the address book design was to say it's soft configured role class, so it's health, doctors, or Dr. Smith, and I can find that with a button. I can find my carers with a button. I can find my family and friends or my people I know. How do I find the people I want to interact in the context of the situation? We've built into it a trusted sharing system where a person can say, I allow John to see my whole session and my calendars and my emails and who I'm talking to at the touch of a button. And then say that interaction event, that shared interaction, can be cancelled immediately by the person concerned. It's trusted user session sharing. So that's part of the address book design. And so it's not so much about, in this case, about the person, one who is one transacting with, like buying a bus ticket. It's actually saying, I need help for my illness, I need carers now, I need maintenance people to come in and fix the wheelchair or something. And we don't seem to address this interaction issue. But when we do, you start to say, well, I need a set of tools and things under that. The engine itself, I've look at it, we've white labelled it so people can take this on board, take it into their organisations, integrate it with a website and put their own branded logos on it. We're a technology provider, not an operator. It supports personal websites. You look at small people in village want to start businesses, you know, doing small crafts things, selling photographs or something, you know, woodworking. So how do they build a little website very quickly to say, this is me online within the context of a village? And it's peer-to-peer mesh, which means we can interconnect these things and build up various nodes of the social cell engine. So we've designed it so we can integrate with legacy systems. Nothing is greenfield, and so we can integrate with that. And it's soft, so we can change it to suit needs. We really tried hard here. This just probably reflects on the approach. We actually launched a collaboration agreement, and I presented this to Ken Wyatt 2 or 3 years ago, about how do we build a social cell system from the ground up to collaborate to help with connecting CDC to NDIS, for instance. I produced these sorts of papers which say we have social cells at the bottom of the food chain for health and care, and we're an NDIS provider. We've actually taken all the Cuba services and matched them with the NDS Consumer's Guide. So we've tried this. It's difficult, it's tough. We've done a couple of village trials where we took Cuba in and we really beat it up to support the users in that village, the administrators, the service providers, the nurses, the hairdressers, the carers, the caterers, the bus trip people, and effectively built kiosks where people with arthritis or can't see very well can go up to a screen and say, I want to book a fish and chip night, and say, that's me, $10 please comes off your little wallet. The amount of paper and forms in these villages is phenomenal because of all the different peoples interacting, use different forms of paper and process. Thousands and thousands of dollars a week go on paper and where it goes and who looks after it and what it is, and the batteries are falling out. But what we're about is how do we make utility out of a platform very quickly to prove in these care environments that things actually have utility and they save people time and they interact better. So we've got soft configured hubs here where people can put in, it's a bowling club, a catering club, a fishing night, feng shui or whatever. They can put their own stuff up very quickly onto it just by going upload. So part of the social inclusion is how do people interact easily through very accessible interfaces. I'll go on another, I think it's stopped. Over the last 6 months, we've been doing a Cubal mesh blockchain. Now imagine Cubal is a mesh system, it's not a central system. It's a peer-to-peer mesh, so each one can talk to each other and find each other as a social infrastructure. Over the top of that, we put, that's what we call a blockchain superstructure, which allows multiple chains. We can configure up to, say, 8 chains per node of different types. One might be help calls, one might be scripts, one might be, say, bus tickets. And over those chains, we've built this developed toolkit, where we can find different block types in different blockchains or all over the blockchains. Imagine the situation where I've got a script in one, medical record in another, and a help call in another one. I want to say, find Mrs. Smith's blocks. That's the sort of utility we're trying to build. And so I think we're the first in the world, if I can say this, with a distributed social cell running multiple blockchains with multiple block types. And we've bent blockchain, we built our own, so it supports GDPR features. Sounds strange? And we've bent blockchain so you can reply to a block. Because on a help call you want to say, that one's confirmed. You want another block somewhere else. This says that one's confirmed. As you can see, we're now moving into an area where we're looking at smart contracts, but this is what we call a DevOps layer, development and operations. How do you actually create chains? How do you test them out? How do you change the schema? How do you find things on them? And then how do you collapse them if they don't work quick and build them in a better way? So it's a tool as well as being functional in that regard. So what's next? We're exploring the transfer of our energy and water resources. We are in the process now of asking people looking at water resource management because of the by nature of it, and energy, how do you do social management of these resource infrastructures? We see that Smart City can embrace the stuff. The next stage we'll be looking at APIs, and we've been asked by a couple of people, can you put a smart contract capability on there so we can actually configure up smart contracts on a social mesh network? So we're getting requests in for this. Looking for proof of concept projects. It's ideas. We're about trying to actually build the social fabric we need for care, water resources and things. And my last point here is, in the past, while identity and governance approaches to information architecture could be simplified in a B2C agenda, because we manage you as a customer, in this agenda we can't. Governance is about me managing me in an infrastructure, or about other people helping me in that infrastructure, or people actually saying this is how we evolve the infrastructure because we have the understanding of it. Next is, if you go to our Cuba website, it's got what we did in the retirement village. So it's got how people in a retirement village use Cuba, people with arthritis, people with poor sight, people with Parkinson's. You'll see that there. You'll see a little movie. The other side of what we do, being on the engineering side, is my website, cubalcloud.com, with papers. And up there you'll see this sort of screen. And we have papers up there on the Cubal story about my mum and why, and what she was suffering from. And identity management, IoT, the village update, and our blockchain superstructure paper. The whole idea of this is, if we need to change and build social infrastructure around distributed, decentralised, trusted environments, this is what we're doing. Not all the answers, but at least we can actually provide that out and say, what do you think? So thank you.
Hello. I work for local government. I'm at the City of Melbourne, so I thought it would be appropriate to talk about the role of local government in utilising digital data tools to enhance social inclusion and active citizenship. So we're here in Melbourne today. I think you're mostly pretty familiar with the city. Interestingly, there's some sides to Melbourne that not everyone's aware of. We are one of the largest student cities in the world. We've got around 200,000 students here, largely between here and Melbourne University up the road. And partly as a result of that, because a lot of these students live in the city, our median age of residence is 28, so we're a fairly young city. And we have today almost 1 million people coming into the city every single day. Melbourne is at a critical juncture at this point in time, and we are facing what I'm calling a triple threat today, because it's convenient. I have 3 things on the slide, but of course the challenges and opportunities we face as a city are more than just a factor of 3. But I guess to make the population growth come to life, if you imagine walking down a street today in Melbourne, first thing you'll notice is that there's lots of barricades and detour signs, because Metro's been constructed and there's still a substantial amount of construction, commercial, student housing, residential across the city. But our streets are full. We've hit peak pedestrians in some parts of the city at peak hour, and yet over the next decade we're going to see around 30% more people on our streets as more people come into work and to study, particularly with the completion of the Metro tunnel. That alone will bring another 18,000 people a day to this part of Melbourne in the north. What's really interesting about that population growth, it's not one size fits all. What we're expecting is in more significant growth amongst residents, children and people with a disability. So what this means is we need to think about digital not just from the classic inclusion in terms of does everyone have access to broadband and does everyone have a smartphone and does everyone know how to use the internet and so on. We actually got to think about, well, how do we actually continue to tap in the tools we have to make it easier for people with a disability to get into and to get around the city and have the same experience we have, for example. We're also facing significant environmental change. City of Melbourne is doing a lot in this space. We have a target of growing tree canopy by 40%, and if you're interested you can email a tree in Melbourne and it will write back to you. And digital disruption, of course, is the reason why we're here today. So what's coming down the pipe? The Internet of Things, 5G, augmented reality, virtual reality, internals, wearables, biometrics, blockchain, etc., etc. These factors create both opportunities and threats for our cities. So to give you some examples, 5G, wonderful. We're going to get more speed and greater capacity in terms of what we can use our phones for in the future. For example, they're about to transmit big data and augmented virtual reality experiences through here. But equally, 5G will create up to 100 times the amount of physical infrastructure in our streets which already need to accommodate 30% more people in the next decade. Autonomous vehicles, great story in terms of safety and congestion. I'm really hoping they'll help free up some of those on-street parking spots so that we can allow the pedestrians to walk there. But equally, for a city government, it means we're going to lose up to 20% of our revenue base, so how do we replace that? So these digital opportunities and threats are something we're constantly navigating on a daily basis here in Melbourne and around Australia. So I look after the Smart City office. Smart City was mentioned earlier. Our Smart City approach at City of Melbourne has a purpose of taking a people-led approach and enabling access to leading digital and data capabilities to support Melbourne as a bold, inspirational and sustainable city. So a couple of things in that. One is that everything we do is to support our council plan, which is informed by a future Melbourne vision that was co-created by our community. The other thing is, I deliberately use the term people-led. We have a City Lab, which is our human-centred design studio. As much as possible with all of our work, we start with the target audience. We actually talk to the residents, the ratepayers, the business owners, the students to get their input in terms of and get their advice in terms of what we do in the future for our city. Everything we do is around solving city challenges and creating benefits for the city. So everything we do needs to point to a specific benefit. So whether it's improving city safety, reducing congestion, reducing city clutter, improving asset utilisation and so on. We think a lot about the economy and what we can do to support growth of gross local product. We think a lot about next generation jobs and how, as more and more jobs are automated, we can lead through Melbourne with creating those jobs of the future. And we think a lot about how we can support our startup community as well. We have 9 core products that underpin our Smart City approach here at City of Melbourne. And some of these products have been around since the 1960s. So we run a census of land use and employment, which literally started in the 1960s. Our Startup Action Plan, on the other hand, was only endorsed by Council 2 years ago. So there's a lot we're doing that draws on existing assets and capabilities, but we're also helping prepare the city for the future. And what I'll do is I'm going to talk through a few examples that bring these products to life for you in a moment. So in terms of the topic of looking at social inclusion and active citizenship, what I thought would make sense is if I created a bit of an end-to-end value chain, if you like, in terms of the role we see digital playing to support all people in Melbourne. As I said, the people come to the city every day to work, live, play and learn are our students, our workers, our visitors and so forth. So working from left to right, first and foremost, it is about digital access and access for everyone. We run a census every second year of homeless people, and something like 80% of our homeless people in Melbourne have a smartphone. Why do they have a smartphone? Because they want to connect. They want to connect with family and friends. And they actually use our facilities, whether it be our libraries for charging, they use the free city Wi-Fi access to the networks. That is really, really important. Our libraries, we're very lucky with our libraries. We have maker spaces, we have sound recording studios, we have your classic training courses on how to use Excel and PowerPoint and how to use the internet. Our libraries are the place for inclusion in Melbourne. They are open to everyone, and we find we get a wide variety of age groups, demographics, cultures coming into our libraries to connect with the digital future. And yes, people still like to read books, which is really important, but equally this is a place where we can help prepare our citizens to really make the most of the digital economy and how it can benefit them. We have an open data platform and do all around data to make tools and visualisations accessible to the community, and I'll show you a couple of examples in the moment. We have a Participate Melbourne website, which is where all of our council draft strategies and plans go up for community consultation, and we have face-to-face as well as digital feedback sessions through that. And we're doing more around challenges and test beds, and the test bed concept in particular to involve the community to have a say before we set new rules and policies for council in relation to digital innovation. So just to jump into a couple of examples, so our open data platform was set up in 2014. We've got over 200 open data sets, and the whole idea is that people can self-serve data. So it means that now we get fewer FOR requests, which is a good thing because it means people can access the data without having to go through a formal channel and wait for a month. You can go online and have a look in real time to see where the parking spaces are available in Melbourne right now. That's updated every 2 minutes. And more the data sets we're putting on here are to allow startups, in this case we have startups that use this data and generate revenue from it. But equally, in the future we'd really love for people who are carers for someone with a disability to find where there's a available disabled spot to be able to drive straight in there rather than have to drive around and do laps of the city. So this is really about making sure that the tools of the city and the keys of the city, if you like, are available to anyone. This is our 3D development activity model. Basically, the grey forms are the current built form of the city. And what you see in terms of different colour graduations is what our city might look like in the future if all of the current building permits were approved. So we deliberately showed you South Bank because South Bank at the moment is only half full. We're expecting South Bank's population to double in the next decade. And this image might be a year old now as I think about it, but what you see is you just look at South Bank. So grey is the current built form. At this point in time, the blue was where there are applications in place that hadn't been approved. The greens had been approved, in this case mostly by state government, and the yellows were under construction. So this is a great tool of digital democracy. In the past, if you were a resident living in one of these grey blocks, you get a letter in the mail saying someone next door has applied for a planning permit and come into our office and you can look at incomprehensible diagrams and instructions. Now you can just get online and have a look and imagine, you can literally move this around to toggle to where your apartment is and look around and see, well, what's it going to mean to me? Is there going to be overshadowing and what's the built form that's being proposed and so on. So this is, Docklands is still only half full in terms of residential as well, but then there's commercial on top of that. Participate Melbourne's... Sorry, no, Docklands is busy now. It's very busy now. Participate Melbourne is our website where we encourage people to go online and provide feedback. So, for example, one of my plans went through this process recently. It was a public realm action plan for City North that relates to our innovation district here. And we had 30 submissions online, but actually a lot of residents groups contacted us and we went and presented them in person. And we really believe in the value of the face-to-face. As much as we're the Smart City office, for us it is about connecting with people at every level, and we love meeting with people face-to-face. And it's actually where you get both that we find we have the biggest impact. The best thing about this is that, if you're a resident and you only get online at 9 o'clock at night after being at work all day and then dealing with your kids or whatever, at least they can still access it. And that's one of the main benefits of this channel. Melbourne Sydney DNA, this is my current favourite project. What you see there is a 3D printed model of part of the Hoddle grid. And we are currently now here at RMIT printing out our entire municipality, all 37 square kilometres in one of these buildings. This is for an exhibit we're moving to our town hall ground floor. And the idea is we're going to have an active exhibit which the public can access during normal business hours. We'll also use it for community consultation, in addition to the printed model of the city, so you can actually see different overlays in terms of data. We'll have augmented and virtual reality tools. So the theme we'll be trialling next for this exhibit is around city disruption. So we've been doing a lot of work working with all the different companies that are digging up the streets and building new buildings at the moment. We've been dealing with the businesses and the residents who are nearby and co-designing tools. Interestingly, the tools are things like posters on site as well as digital tools and maps and things like that. But we're going to be piloting this city disruption theme in our next pilot of this exhibit at our Innovation Festival in May. Just moving through open innovation competitions. So this is another favourite project. Once a year at the moment we run a competition on a theme or a problem to solve for the city. The one you see here was for improving city accessibility for people with a disability. So what we did about a year ago is we had a 6-week period where we released relevant open data sets that related to navigating the physical city. We offered a cash prize. We partnered with Telstra, Accenture, Microsoft and others. We worked with City Melbourne's Disability Advisory Committee, and they're in the judging panel as well for this competition. And we had over 30 startups and groups of students and companies pitch to win this competition. And interestingly, the group that won created a pilot app. It's voice enabled. So if you are caring for a relative who is in a wheelchair, for example, and you're at home and you want to take them to dinner, but you want to take them to somewhere nice, not just McDonald's. It's really hard to find an accessible restaurant in Melbourne, I'm learning, and yet we're a foodie city, so this is something we've got to get right. But what you can do through this tool is navigate a whole range of City Melbourne data sets. So the first one will, if you say, I want to go to a Chinese restaurant near the corner of Queen and Burke Streets, it will highlight a few of those restaurants and then rate them in terms of accessibility. Then you can click on the restaurant you want, then it will help you find a disabled parking spot nearby. And as you're driving in, if that parking space is then filled, it will navigate you to the next closest parking spot. And then once you get out of the car, it'll navigate you to the most accessible entrance to that restaurant. So that was all voice-based for this particular pilot tool, and we're looking for opportunities to support that startup now so they can actually scale that out as a tool not just for Melbourne, but nationally across Australia. Last example here is our 5G and Internet of Things testbed. So we've been advised that as a local government agency, we're the first local government to be leading a 5G testbed in Australia. The reason we're doing this, 5G goes live in March next year. But we ran a series of workshops last year with telcos, hardware software providers, researchers, startups and others to say, well, 5G is coming, how do we make sure Melbourne gets maximum benefit and it's accessible to everyone? And there's a real theme around accessibility and affordability and coverage. And interesting, the feedback that came back was, yeah, you're probably going to get the coverage, but actually it's the clutter you've got to worry about because of all the small cells that's going to be required with 5G. So in the back of that, we launched an expression of interest to co-design a 5G and Internet of Things testbed in Carlton. We had over 20 submissions, and we're launching this testbed over the coming weeks. And we're really excited. I've invited some residents groups as well to participate in this testbed. But this is great because it will allow us to co-design the ideal governance structures, information sharing agreements and infrastructure design for these testbeds, which means we've done in a way that takes into account our public realm and the beautiful Melbourne we have today, the cost to telcos, the planning requirements and that sort of thing, so that we end up with a 5G and IoT rollout that is accessible to everyone but is done in a way that protects the public realm. So that's just a couple of examples. I hope that's helped bring to life our approach to digital at the City of Melbourne, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I was hoping to go last so I could take the whole last hour. Paul can do that now.
No, he can't, 'cause I'm in charge.
Oh. All right. Great to be here. I'm going to talk about consumer trust and confidence and personal responsibility online. So when I wind the clock back to 2002, when I started my journey, let's call it in the online environment, I was in the Australian Federal Police. We started up a little body called the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre, mirrored on the UK National High-Tech Crime Unit. We did a range of stuff, I won't bore you with that. But there's two seminal points that I want to talk about from that time. One is when we talk, and these are focused on trust and safety, by the way. There was other seminal points, but we don't have the last hour. So two things really happened. One was eBay came into prominence. And eBay, I believe, from that time, were one of the first to really tackle what is trust and safety online. Because back then, our idea of sort of call it going on the internet was going to the spare room of your house and you had a clunky old desktop and you had dial-up, most probably. And the concept of buying something from someone that you had no idea who that person was and whether it was going to turn up was a pretty novel concept, I would argue, for a lot of Australians. But I would argue they, on the whole, solved it with simple things like feedback ratings and the little 5 stars and those sorts of things. And you could... Sorry? Kudos. Yes. So they solved a lot of it in very simple forms. And I think it was very successful. If we fast forward to Uber today, they have 5 stars. So I believe that was a very successful model for gaining trust with someone that you've never met before on the hope that something would turn up eventually. And then they had some back end, this is before machine learning was really going gangbusters, but they had some people looking at things and they had algorithms and they did a lot of work in the broader community, a lot of intelligence work. For example, they could tell you that if someone had a triple flask distillate vase thing for sale, they were probably a drug dealer because they were doing methamphetamine in the backyard with it. So, they'd ring up the police and they go, we're seeing this advertisement, you might want to go and knock on their door, and 99 times out of 100 that's what they found. So a lot of general smarts went into what they were looking at. The next seminal point I want to talk about is April 2002. A month I remember distinctly, and that was the first phishing investigation that we conducted. It was a dodgy looking Commonwealth Bank site. We went up to Sydney, we arrested a guy, he was Russian, And we unarrested him. It's a long story. But from then on, fishing was the gift that kept on giving. And again, still to this day, fishing is out there because it works. And it's permeated in all shapes and sizes and all sorts of things, mobile and blah, blah, blah. But it's still there today because it still works. So what's really changed in that time? So obviously we've had some seminal things, and I won't trot out the stats because I'm going to put the pressure on Paul for that, but we have mobile smart devices, and we love our mobile smart devices. Invariably, I would argue, the last thing you do before you go to bed is check your phone, and the first thing you do when you wake up is check your phone, and you're on it all day. Invariably speaking, it goes back to our stat of homeless people. They're great enablers. So how is that the way we now consume the internet, as far as being always on it, really changed the trust and safety dividend? Or has it not? Happy to take questions on that when we have a bit of a discussion. So I love to bust metaphors to pieces. I'm going to try and be good today, but I'm going to look at the car industry as being my favourite example. And if we wind the clock back to, let's call it the 50s or something, when cars were starting to get safe and they put radial tyres on them and seat belts, and then we had seatbelt pre-tensioners, and then we had airbags, and then we had lots of airbags, and now we have really safe cars. And the manufacturers have done it all. We have 5-star ratings with cars. And I would argue everyone, when they go looking for a new car, even the second-hand cars, looks for the rating of the car. So, for example, most cars now have been dragged into that 5-star rating. Probably so many are in that 5-star rating, we probably now need to have a 10-star rating to look at the minutiae of that. Unless, of course, you buy one of the Ford Mustangs, and as great as they look, they have a 2-star safety rating. They're American, what do you expect? So we look at that, and so we look at manufacturers in the vehicle industry have really lifted their game. When you look at what the government has done, when it comes to road safety, they've really lifted their game. Roads have become a lot safer. We have police out there. We have overt police cars, we have covert police cars, we have vans that sit on the side of the road, some with signs, some with don't. We have traffic cameras to the razoo. I can tell you in Canberra, we definitely have those. We have all this range of things. And you would argue roads and driving has become safer. And then you look at the third part of the component. You look at us as end users. We've sort of gone through this history of drink driving, for example, when some of us might be of an age, some of them even Laurie's age, where you've gone through the... deliberately so. Where we've gone through this era of where you might have got done for drink driving, and everyone would say, well, that was unfortunate, to now that you're a social pariah of like, I don't really want to hang out with you because that's not how you behave on the road. And we have adjusted our behaviour on the roads for things like speeding and a whole lot of other stuff. And so we've upped our game as people. So there's been this whole upping of the game by the three, what I would say, key components with road safety. Yet we still have about 1,000 people a year die on the roads, and I don't know how many tens of thousands of just general road trauma. And we've come to accept that as being okay as a society. I'm not saying whether that's right or whether it's wrong, it should be okay, but that's what we've agreed with. And our governments, federally and state, continue in every budget to continually upping the investment. Cars getting safer, we're getting smarter, but we still have around that same sort of... It's been consistent for a lot of years, the road deaths. So let's go back to online. So what are we seeing when it comes to the trust and safety deficit, and what are some of my observations? So we'll go to manufacturers. And by manufacturers, I'm going to talk about the whole corporate ecosystem, not just device manufacturers. I'm not talking about next-gen firewalls and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to talk about social media companies. And Christchurch will be a great example with that, with all the media that's been going on in the last couple of weeks. So when we look at social media, and I don't mind giving them the odd kicking. In fact, if you just look at what I've been saying in the last couple of weeks, I've been giving them a lot of kicking, but I've been kicking them for a lot of years. And I find the social media companies to be really interesting because they've built a product which has been going now for some years, and it's an evolving product. Most of us can remember when MySpace was a thing. We've got Facebook, for example. Anyone with teenage or early 20 kids, which I've got, will tell you that Facebook is not a thing. They've well moved on from that. So there is this slow evolution. To me, Facebook was around for a very long time. But you've got these companies that have built a, let's call it a product or a service, I call it both, which we've come to rely on for various reasons, but they've built it, I would argue, with no risk management involved. If you build cars, you've got risk management as far as your platform, and that's why you build safe cars. If you build blenders that you can put your banana smoothie in the morning, there's standards that you have to abide by, and there's risk management issues around that so that you don't put your hand in and lose your fingers. But I would argue the social media phenomenon has not had any of that built into it. And I think that's a problem. I don't think they've been forced or otherwise, whether it's by consumer sentiment or government regulation or anything. We'll talk about government regulation shortly. That's where I take up my whole hour. Forcing them to build safe products, whereas everything else in the economy has got a risk management component to the manufacture thereof. So that's the first thing. Our products, generally speaking, I don't think are built with trust and safety. And there's various reasons. Again, I have many soapboxes all the way down Swanston Street. I've got soapboxes on why I think so. And a lot of that really comes down to commercial drivers. And when you're a US-based corporate and you're focused on earnings per share per quarter, then I would argue you don't really like focusing on the L in the P&L and putting people in your trust and safety team, of which eBay back in the day had substantial people in it globally, and they talked and they did things. I'm just not seeing sufficient of that. And now we have, I would argue, much more advanced algorithms. They don't have to do physical searches to look for a picture to say, we know from our smarts and our intelligence that that person's a drug dealer. So we need a system somehow to build much more trustworthy products. And we can take that across a whole range of different things, but in the interest of time, I won't go on any more examples. So if we look at how government should be involved, and government, I hate to say this, kind of done not a bad job. I look at the Office of the eSafety Commissioner, and I see that as a shining beacon of greatness. There is a lot of really good stuff that has come there, either when it was started with Alistair or Julian McGrant now. Always helps when you have key people that give a damn, and I see a lot of greatness coming out of that. And arguably it'd be good if that office was tripled and a whole lot of other things happened. But then I look at other things that government done. I go back to my law enforcement roots. We see very few criminal investigations for cybercrime. Very few. And I did some media last week. You might have seen it, you probably didn't see it down here in Melbourne, but it was the centre stage for the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Rob Oakeshott, for those that might have heard the name, a kingmaker back in the Gillard government, having another crack at government. He apparently made $70,000 just from his election rebate last time, so why wouldn't you? Someone set up a false Rob Oakeshott Instagram page and started accepting donations. So the New South Wales Police were doing a whole lot of media about what were they doing. And they were doing nothing. And their number one answer was jurisdiction. Oh, overseas, it's all too hard. Nothing frustrates me more than when people pull out the jurisdiction card, because it's a misnomer. We have international agreements. We have a whole range of things that we can do. Sure, the investigations might be more complicated, but it doesn't mean they're not doable. So police need to step up, and they kind of slowly are. If you look at, I'll pick on the New South Wales Police, they've done a couple of, I would argue, simple but seminal investigations. I don't know if you saw in the media down here, the Go-Get cars. A guy called Robert Kubrovich, for anyone that knows him. They arrested him in Wollongong, south of Sydney, but 2 months ago. And he just did a very simple thing of hacking into the platform and giving himself free rides on the Go-Get cars. Now, he's a pretty simple guy, because each time he hacked in and used a free ride, he drove home with it. And one thing I can tell you about 21 years in the police, I love stupid criminals. So he might not be the sharpest knife in the drawer. So they did that. And it was one of these, it was all in the same jurisdiction. Great. Big tick to them, massive kudos to them. They also, but a month ago, doing a drug investigation, stumbled on this thing called the dark web and some cryptocurrency. And again, they locked up in Sydney a male and female for having, goods in custody in the form of cryptocurrencies. Couldn't be more of a big tick ever. We need a lot more of this happening, because without the police presence, again, go back to my road scenario, you're not going to get people changing. I then look at my other favourite punching bag, and that's the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, my other great disappointment in life. I remember distinctly, and Mark, you might be the same, of the lead up to the notifiable data breach legislation. February last year, we had the Australian Law Reform Commission from I don't know how many years before that suggesting it, every man and their dog suggesting it. We finally get it, and then you look at how it plays out in process. And anyone that's looked at the form, it's a pretty clunky form. I've known a few organisations that have tried to self-report, and it's very unintuitive. You don't know what you are reporting about, what the boxes you should tick. But let's suffice to say they produce quarterly figures, and they're around about, and we're 14 months into it, around about 270 self-referrals per quarter. So we're up over 1,100 by now. And of course we have a regime of fines, we have personal fines, corporate fines, and enforceable undertakings. And so you think to yourself, this is pretty good, but what are they doing about it? What's the investigations at the back end? What are the amount of fines that have been given out? Well, I'm happy to tell you there's been 0 fines given out. And so you think to yourself, there might be 1 or 2 unscrupulous corporates out there that might be kicking back that have had a data breach of some description. And of course there's a few definitional issues with the notifiable data breach scheme about serious harm, which you can fudge, and the fact that we have 28 days to report versus the Europeans with 72 hours. But we'll park that to one side. And I'm sure there's a few unscrupulous corporates out there that think, well, no one's been fined for not reporting. Why would I report? Why don't I just run the gamut, because it's pretty low risk? So we don't have that part of government really stepping up. And then we'll go back to looking at Christchurch. And Christchurch, I think, is a seminal matter for all the wrong reasons. So of course we had a horrendous matter, just unfathomable what happened over there. So you had a person taking live video, and of course we have I would argue, a knee-jerk reaction by governments, particularly in Australia, about let's introduce legislation that went through the Parliament. I don't know if it passed by the Senate last night. You have this weird idea of jail time for the marketing person of a US corporate, and I'm a believer that jails for violent offenders, not for anyone else. You could argue it, the big stick and all that sort of stuff, but I don't buy that. So you have that as a knee-jerk for what it is. And of course, I would argue there's no court in this country that would impose a jail term on a marketing person of a US corporate. So why bother introducing it? So we have that as a regulation, ill thought out. They're doing something. I suppose you could put the positive spin. We have fines. I'm all for fines, but a fining regime just because you're a big corporate, choosing turnover I don't think is the right way of fining. Fines should be based on the amount of offending, not the fact that you're worth $2 billion worth or worth $200,000 or anywhere in between. So we have this legislation meandering its way through, and we'll see how it ever pans out. But let's get back to the us in all this equation, and I can't remember the stats of how many times the video was shared. I think it was 4,000 or something before it was removed. And we all know what the internet's like. The internet never forgets. Just because a Facebook or a Google or a WhatsApp or a Twitter or whatever take it down, it's going to be served and cached and all these other sorts of things. But I think if we're really, to finish off with, if we're really going to step up, we need to look at our own personal responsibility. And I'm going to go back to the car thing. We accept there's 1,000 people a year die on the roads. We need to accept what is our role in the online environment. Why do we share it? Why do people share it? Why do people flame each other on social media? What is it with this whole concept of being the voyeurism when it comes to these sorts of things? And if anyone here has been involved in watching those first-person shooter games, they are extremely lifelike and extremely similar to what the Australian, I can't even remember his name now, the Australian guy did in Christchurch. Sorry?
We don't want to.
No, good point. He had a camera strapped to him and he went around taking live video just like it is on the first-person shooter games, which you can dial into and watch other people play games. So I think we need to have a really big conversation when it comes to trust and safety and what it means to be a good digital citizen. What does it mean to act ethically, lawfully and responsibly online, just like we do in the real world? And it's great to have these games. I'm not particularly a gamer, but it's great to have those. I'm not an anti-gamer. But what is it? Where's the crossover and what are we going to do about it? Because it's great to have government doing more things. It's great to have corporates potentially doing more things. But what are we going to do to really take us out of the cesspool for some of these things and make it more Nirvana-like? But we're happy to talk about it later. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody. My background is in telecommunications and in particularly looking at the social and economic benefits that we get from telecommunications. And a couple of examples, I was involved with the previous government, the Labour government, in trying to develop a fibre to the home network, NBN, and the reason why we actually got that through at that point in time politically was, again, the social and economic benefits. Another project I'm involved in has been I'm the initiator together with the Secretary General of the ITU, the previous Secretary General of the ITU, Hamidou Touré, in establishing the United Nations Broadband Commission for Digital Development. And again, the only reason why we did it is that there are a lot of social and economic benefits coming from the new digital technologies and telecommunications infrastructure. So the social and economic benefits is the key reason why we have these new digital technologies. Now, if we look at, we have just the budget behind us and we've got the elections in front of us, and it's now a good time to start looking at leadership. And what we start seeing happening over the last number of years, perhaps even the last decades, is a crisis in leadership. That's happening everywhere. You look at Trump in America, you look at Brexit, you look at Turkey, Poland, Hungary, Italy. I mean, it's a never-ending list at the moment. Of course, we've got our own troubles here in Australia with, I don't know, 5 or 6 prime ministers in 5 or 6 years. So clearly, there's something wrong here in the governance and leadership sort of issue. And that's an area where I've been concentrating on quite a bit in my discussions with government, with businesses, with cities, in showing that leadership from where you can actually then start looking at the interest, the national interest or the local interest of your community or your city, and start looking at how to best address it. If you start looking at the leadership crisis that we have around the world, then it's very hard to escape that perhaps the last time that happened was well before most of us, if not all of us, happened. Perhaps our parents and grandparents, remember the 1930s. So it's quite shocking, to think about that, for nearly 100 years, we have had, reasonable good success in that particular area. If you look at the progress that we've made, particularly after World War II, then, it's great to see that happening. Not just in Australia, we all talk about poverty and things like that, but poverty is significantly less, and particularly, for example, in areas such as Africa. Of course, we've got poverty in Australia as well, but it's no comparison to what some of the people in the Middle East or in Africa or, some parts of Asia still have. But, all of that has improved very, very dramatically over the last couple of decades. So actually, what has gone wrong? If you've got this leadership crisis, what has gone wrong over the last 20, 30 years? And I think it has been a situation where government has slowly started stepping away from leadership. They started handing over leadership to corporate organizations, the so-called market-driven trend that we've been seeing over the last couple of decades. And that has seen that the government is not only providing the same level of leadership it had before, at the same time it's actually lost in creating leadership. If you look at the crisis around the world, it's not a matter of we've got a crisis. No, the people who are our leaders, have absolutely no clue on how to address these issues nowadays. So that is something that they have missed out over the last 20 or 30 years by laying back and just said the market will solve all of our problems. I came across an interesting quote from Oscar Wilde, and that is, what's the tragedy in life? The tragedy in life is that you don't get what you want, but even a worse tragedy is that you get everything that you want. And I was thinking of that when Mark Zuckerberg came cap in hand to the government and said, please regulate us. So they got all the freedom in the world, something that Nigel referred to already. They got all the freedom in the world to do basically what they want. They didn't have to put any risk assessments into their products and services. And now they say, oh my God, what on earth are we going to do? We now have to come back to the government for leadership. And as we then saw in Australia, there's absolutely 0.0 leadership. I think the most stupid thing that this government has done just yesterday is passing these legislation. I go one step further than your criticism on it, Nigel. I think it's stupid. I think it's totally irrelevant. You can't do anything with it. It's pure political in order to get another point-scoring exercise for the next election. And the same basically applied with the cybersecurity legislation, the so-called AA legislation that was rushed through Parliament in December last year. It clearly shows if you would run a business like that, you would go broke. You have to actually sit down, assess what you want to address, and then actually start making decisions on how you're going to address that. So address what are the problems with social media. There are plenty of them. Then start addressing them, and then start looking at what the solutions are. Unfortunately, both for Australia as for our friend Trump, you can't do anything in isolation anymore. We live in a global world, if we like it or not, and we have to solve problems globally and not locally. So we really see that we might have to go back to the situations in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, when we had a far more a multi-stakeholder sort of approach to leadership. We consulted with each other, we worked with each other, we looked towards the center, and we came with solutions in that situation. The government worked together with business, with the people, and you had the social codes, quite often referred to, where you have a far more consultative approach and a far more cohesive approach to starting looking at decision-making processes and not rushing things overnight. So we start seeing things coming back. Amazingly, while including myself, we've got a lot of criticism about the way that the Chinese run their country and the sort of autocracy that you see in that country. The interesting thing on the other side is, yes, the government in China has an enormous influence in its local business, in its society, in everything. But on the other side, in its economic policies, in its environmental policies, it actually has this stakeholder approach. They say, business, you have a responsibility to look after X, Y, Z within the policies that they create. Now, I'm the last one who say we should go to China for advice on how to run a democracy or something like that. But we can learn from things. We can learn that you don't have to have just this next quarter profit-driven situation. You can have a more cohesive policy in that respect. And I believe that digital technologies are going to play a key role in all of that, and are already playing a key role on that. I wrote an article for Independent Australian this morning on the budget, And, you know, it's just amazing to see that, you know, the word communications is used once, the word internet is used once, and the word digital is used once, yeah? And for the rest, it's you can't find it back, yeah? And but when I thought about it, you know, if you then start looking at the sort of initiatives that they've taken, there's no way in the world that these initiatives don't take into account digital technologies. You know, if you do infrastructure projects, if you do healthcare projects, if you do whatever you do, you know, digital has become such an incredible element in it. But obviously they didn't want to refer back to our digital prime minister that we had shortly before this one, and so anything digital was wiped out of the budget, of course, just to avoid that the remembrance of the previous prime minister. So you see really that we have already taken steps way beyond leadership in the government. If you look at climate change, then there's hardly any business in energy, in construction or whatever that hasn't taken climate change on board, that hasn't taken the environment on board, who are not investing in renewables. They are. Yeah? So the government is so far behind in a situation like that. Yeah? If you look at the whole way that we businesses, we people use digital technologies, again, exactly the same. You know, if you then hear to our parliamentarians, our politicians, yeah, then you think, on what planet are they living? So I think the digital transition takes place in 3 levels. And the first level, let's talk about the politics, democracy, things like that. I think that we have taken over part of that role already. You know, I think Nigel was talking about responsibilities that we individuals will have to take. Yeah, I think inadvertently we are doing that. I mean, if you look at I read it the other day, 150 million groups on Facebook. Yeah. Of community people, of local people, of clubs, of environmental groups, of political groups, who are all combining their forces on social media, particularly Facebook, and start talking with each other about, you know, democracy, about how to create a better world, you know, whatever, yeah, how to run the Scouts or whatever, doesn't matter. But people are really connecting each other, and you start seeing this grassroots level of democracy happening. And I think that's where it will have to come from. It's not coming from the federal government. It's not coming from our global leaders anymore. It's up to us. And that's one of the reasons why over the last decade I've been extremely busy and have lots of work with local councils, because I honestly believe that you know, if we want to do something, if we want to we want to address some of the problems that we are facing, doesn't matter if it's climate change, it's the arrival of refugees or migrants or transport or whatever, it all comes down at the cities. Yeah. Not in Canberra, in Parliament House. Yeah? It's happening in Melbourne, in Sydney, in Geelong, in Canberra, in Newcastle, in Bendigo, what have you. That's where it's happening. So if you actually, and there, you know, you don't have the same political problems. Yeah, in the bigger cities a little bit more than the smaller cities, but in general terms you don't have this adversary politics that you see every day in Canberra. Yeah, it's like a schoolyard boys fight. Yeah, we don't have that in most cities. We don't have that. So you really have there the opportunity to work towards that sort of solutions. Ingredients there are very much, you need the mayor as the leader. You really need a leader there. Comes back to leadership, yeah, what I mentioned before. If the mayor is not behind it, if they don't take the political leadership, you know, it's a lost cause. You will never get it going. Secondly, you need the CEO, the town clerk, or however you want to call it in your city, you know, because the city is enormously silo-based. Yeah? You've got all sorts of silos in the bureaucracy, and a smart city only works if you have a horizontal layer. So you have to have big silo-busting activities in order to create that. The digital technology works across everything. You know, it doesn't matter if you talk about the infrastructure, the social media, the cloud, you know, artificial intelligence, whatever. It works across things. So on the economic side of it, you know, it makes sense to cut through the silos and start looking at a holistic approach to the city, and then actually start looking at what sort of projects you need to do. Then you need your stakeholders. Who are your stakeholders? You know, the healthcare, the education, the transport, and everybody else, businesses. All bring them together and bring them in that sort of situation. So apart from, I'm working with a dozen cities in Australia and altogether 25 internationally. And what I'm basically trying to do is create that collaboration between cities, because one of the problems with cities is that they are quite isolated. There's not an automatic way for cities to work together. Yeah, I mean, if you go to the smaller cities, if you forget about Melbourne, Sydney, and whatever, people from Geelong can't travel to Newcastle, for example, if there would be something to do. There would be a massive exercise, to get your budget for things like that. Yeah, so you really need that collaboration between cities, and that's a little of a problem. Now, one of the things that I did is I worked with the Lord Mayors of the country, and they have an association, a council, and I don't know, Michelle, if you were aware, if you were part of that, but since the beginning of this year, they now have set up a smart city group within the Lord Mayor's Council and starting to look at how they can work together. And the next step from there is then, how they could work with the next 20 cities, because then you get the second tier cities and work together. So that collaboration is, in my opinion, important. Separately from the cities, I've set up an industry group, so 25 industries, Telstra, Optus, IBM, you name them, that sort of companies, and an university group, 12 universities. Why? Because if you want to create these sort of digital transformation in cities, you have the council as the leaders. They are the leaders of the project. Then you need, of course, the industry to assist in creating the business models and the investment models. And you need the universities, let's say, for data security, for all sorts of interesting things that can come out of the universities in that sort of area. So we're working with a couple of cities along those lines. Ipswich, for example, in Queensland, Newcastle in New South Wales, Bendigo here in Victoria, and trying to actually get these collaboration projects going. So I think that by bringing the leadership down, first of all to us, but secondly, also to the cities, that really works. Now, how does then this works together with citizens? Because that is us, of course. In my opinion, and again, based on lessons learned, particularly overseas, that engaging the citizens on a way like town hall meetings is disastrous. It doesn't work. If you want to do anything, as long as it's not in my backyard. So what you need to do is engage with citizens very much on a project basis. So you have, as a city, you have a holistic approach. You know what you want to do. You look at the various projects, and then you go for the people, the citizens that are involved in that, either specialized because of their interest in, let's say, the environment, environmental groups, or people in a particular suburbs because of the fact that, and you work with that. And that sort of projects, we see that now in Copenhagen and Amsterdam, for example, these are working much better than previous sort of situations or town hall meetings. The other thing, what you see with citizen engagement is also, it's an ongoing process. It's not once a week or once a month coming up with a bulletin or a meeting. It's very much that, there are chat groups, there's internet, there's websites. There is this full interaction with citizens in making that happening. So I think that if you talk about leadership, then you really start looking at coming that from the bottom. Now, obviously, you will need and Michelle will know that better than anybody else, you do need the assistance of the state government and the federal government. So you have to have that level, particularly in finance situations, you need that combination going. But in my opinion, it should be driven from the cities, and the cities should take more political power in that situation, in getting their words heard better in Canberra. I mean, the Lord Mayors are actually the only groups of mayors that are working together in a way that they also start getting political recognition. You see that around the world. You see that in America, you see that in Europe, where the mayors are taking a much bigger political role than they've ever seen before, because they have the problems. That's where the population ends up. That's where you've got climate change. So you really start seeing that sort of activities happening. Now, obviously, the other elements of digital transformation in the economy, it's already been mentioned several times. You've got jobs, you've got new businesses. It totally makes sense to do things like that, yeah. And on the social side, society side, you really start seeing things like e-health and education and things like that. Now, one of my biggest complaints with the budget, and one of my biggest complaints in general with governance in that situation, is what we need is a vision. What we need is a long-term strategy, and not these stupid things like there's an election tomorrow and here's $7 billion as a handout. If you've got $7 billion to spend, let's come with a plan for the country. Let's come with a national plan and say for the next 10 or 20 years, this is where we want to go. And here is where we're going to invest now. And here's where we're going to invest next. And yes, there could be a downturn. Adjust your program, but don't have these sort of backflips as we've been seeing with the NBN. Today it's this government, so we go in that direction. Tomorrow it's another government, we go in that direction. With $50 billion wasting, yeah? I mean, how ridiculous is that, yeah? So if we have a long-term plan, then we should stick to it. It should be in the national interest, not in the interest of political parties. Yeah? So it should be in the national interest. And then we can actually start seeing good investments going into cities, good investments going into e-health, and things like that as well. And I think, because I'm talking to people from government, bureaucrats are not necessarily the leaders. Yeah? But you can do a lot in this area, in your own department, as we heard from Michelle, in your city, yeah? You can actually do a lot on that level to start looking at this digital transformation, at how we can actually spread the leadership, broaden the leadership, get more people involved, and start working to outcomes like this. Thank you very much.
Alexander has been with us for the last couple of days and is from Estonia, and he always has something very interesting to say.
So something more general about this transition to get that going in digital transition. What I've observed, and I'm not Estonian, I just lived there for 5 years, but legislation plays a big role. And so, for example, what they've done in Estonia to break through these silos and get cross-city and cross-department and whatever collaboration going, is to have a drastic law introduction, something like it's not allowed for any data set to exist more than one time, because the repercussions are then enormous. No, that's not the point. It's more, so like what they have in Estonia, which they now pride themselves as being a blockchain for whatever crazy reasons, but they have an X-road backbone system, which is a secure data transition bus between databases that exist around the country. And if you now have to get into some sort of bureaucratic act, then basically through this X-road system, and given that every data set can only exist one time, then through the X-road infrastructure, you can, on the fly, get all the data exchange going to basically very fast complete your bureaucratic act.
Yeah, I think legislation and that sort of strategy set in concrete, yeah, they obviously, are a big stick, to make things happening. What my experience is that, first of all, I think in Australia there are not more than 20 councils that I would call smart, and that is typically, I work internationally, that's in every country. Yeah, you've got some leaders, and then you've got a lot of companies. I quite often say, these smart cities, it's more death by pilot. Yeah, they have a particular project in a silo. Yeah, and then the whole thing, there's no scaling up sort of situation. But the way that you can only create a smart city if you start with the leadership. If you don't start with the leadership, yeah, There are plenty of people at the bottom or wherever in the organisation that have brilliant projects and have good ideas, but they don't get it up to that level to make it happen. So if you've got the leadership, and then you have to take the people within council on board. You have to have meetings with all the directors. You have meetings, and that, when in my experience, it can take up to a year to get everybody in the council, not everybody, most people in the council to actually go behind the plan and participate in it. Because quite often it's back to my ivory tower, sorry, you don't get this data set, it's so privacy, it's so secure, nobody else in the whole organisation can have this, Otherwise you get that sort of situation. Unless the CEO says, sorry, this is the rules, this is how we're going to do it. Says we do need some leadership from the top in either ways through strategies or directions or legislation to make it happen. Otherwise it's not going to happen. Fully agree.
Okay. A word from our sponsor, Dr. Mark Gregory.
So I want to go back to the open data, and especially the work that the City of Melbourne is doing, because it appears to me that there's really two key things happening in this, sort of local government. One is we're getting more open data initiatives, which allows more innovation and more changes to the way that people are doing things within a city. But the second one is that, and I'm from the City of Kingston, they have their feedback page, and there's more, if you like, direct government rather than the council, our elected representatives making the decisions. There's more direct government by whatever the things that are going on to the council at the next meeting. It's put onto a web page. Everyone provides their feedback. Everyone says whether they think it's good or bad, and then that is one of the inputs to council. It's not like overriding the councillors, but it's seen to be an input. So what do you think of those sorts of things?
Well, I guess I'm speaking through the perspective of local government that has got a strong and long history around co-creation. So our elected officials are elected by the public. And I think see themselves as a channel to represent our public. And, going back a few years ago, we had a citizens jury that unpicked our financial P&L and balance sheet and gave us advice around if they were the executives and the councillors of the day, what they would be doing in terms of where they spend their money. Another plan we have in place is a Future Melbourne 2026, and that plan was co-created by around 100 Melburnians. They represent a diagonal cross-section of our community, and they were selected literally by a random male sample. So we now make sure we had a good representation of students, residents, different age groups, cultures and so on. So we've got a long history around co-creation, and that is with the physical as well as the digital, as I was saying earlier. But to your point earlier, what more and more councillors are doing these days, in addition to what you mentioned about putting their plans up a few days in advance online for people to comment, provide feedback, a lot of them are showing their council meetings live through Facebook or through their website, which means that no longer does everyone have to go in person and go up to Town Hall at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday night, whenever it is. They can watch at home. And in some cases, I think as well, submit questions online for some councils. So I think there's a lot being done to try and ensure that we're living the spirit of democracy as much as possible, embracing all tools to help us do that.
All right. Got any other questions? We're going to one.
My name is Ken Sayers. One of the things I noticed in Michelle's presentation was you're talking about getting opinions from a wide cross-section of people, not just ratepayers. And that's something I find, I'm in Glen Ira. And Glen Ira, I'm actually on their panel, so I get emails with questionnaires as to what I think about certain issues. But it strikes me all of the information I see in our council is to ratepayers, not to residents.
Yep. So the difference in the City of Melbourne, we have this year 928,000 people here in a typical weekday, daytime. Only 148,000 of those people live in the city. So most people come here, don't live here, don't pay rates. We've got around 450,000 jobs. I don't have the number of businesses here because obviously our businesses pay rates. But the point is that most people come to the city, don't pay rates. They don't pay to have the waste bins collected either or the roads cleaned up, but they do come and spend their money. They go out to cafes, they go out to shows, they go and enjoy time in our shopping centres. They often have their jobs here and contribute in other ways. They also occasionally pay parking fines. So I think capital cities are in a bit of a unique position in that sense.
Any more questions on the floor? Because I've got one over to Nigel about those law enforcement agencies and how we get them more active online and in the digital spaces, because I thought you had a lot of good things to say in your presentation. Got any more good ideas about how we do that?
Thanks, Laurie. I think it's just geeing them up to what their role is in the ecosystem. And again, going back to the vehicle, and I can bust other metaphors as I said, but going back to how police operate on the roads. And it's taken them a lot of decades. As I said, we have overt police cars, we have covert police cars, they do schools presentations, they do all this range of stuff. We need to drop that in the online environment, because I'm a believer the internet is just a public place. And so you should have policing in the public place. But the reality is, the front page of The Age talks about African youth gangs and motorcycle gangs and random breath testing and violent assault and all those things. And so the police minister goes to Graham Ashton as the police commissioner and says, fix that up. Even though we see, look at some of the reporting that we get, look at scams. We've got Scam Watch, I can't remember what the figures are, it's about 80 million a year. We wouldn't have a clue what level of under-reporting it is. You look at ransomware, you look at business email compromise, you look at all these things online. Why is that not being picked up front and centre by policing? And as we spend more and more of our time in the online environment, policing resources should be spending more of their time online in that.
Yeah, because, I mean, I said just a very interesting story. We get a lot of contacts from people that have been scammed, of course. Obviously, we can't do much about it. We just point them to the right places to report it. And obviously, if it's a banking issue or a ID fraud, what they can do. Fascinating one recently from a gentleman who considers himself pretty IT savvy. He's in his 70s. He found out he had cancer, so he's having a bad week. And he got caught out by the Telstra scam. You know, somebody rings up and says, I'm from Telstra, you've got something wrong with your computer. How about you download something and I'll fix it for you? Anyway, he told me when he was telling the story, luckily he didn't lose any money, but he told me when he was telling the story that the scammer gave him better customer service than Telstra. And he should have known at that point something was wrong. Because this is the thing, is the fact that it's, you know, they work towards consumer behaviour. You know,
look, it's a really good point. And
I've helped people fix problems with Telstra by contacts I have.
Look, it's a good point, and criminals can be amazingly rational creatures, and they will provide service. We're having a chat at lunch talking about ransomware, and people pay up. You know, the criminals will give the encryption or the decryption keys back every now and then, because if it got out there that you never got your data back, no one would ever pay. So it's a business model. Yeah. So it's really quite interesting, but that's sort of the way it goes. But reporting crime is a really difficult thing to do. Yes. So if we use our real world and the online sort of concept, if something happens to one of us, we'll go to the local police station and hopefully with confidence report a crime. But the reality is most police stations it's getting harder. You've got the most junior police officer on shift and they really don't want to care when you say the word, you know, I scammed, spammed, whatever it might be. You've got a thing called Acorn, which is another disaster that most people have never heard of, and again, it's got a really poor user experience. Yeah. And it's just a black hole of nothingness when it goes to the jurisdictions.
Yeah, you put your complaint in.
You need a microphone, no one can hear you.
You got your complaint. I've done it because I get quite a lot of calls from people who then say, I know you from the press or whatever, I had this, yeah? So then I help them and say, okay, go to this website and put... Nobody gets an answer back. Nobody gets an answer back. So you don't know if it's taken serious or not. So then people are giving up. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what they want. That's the whole issue. And the great thing about fraud generally, but particularly online fraud, is you always keep the value low and the volume high, and guarantee you'll never get caught. There's no triage at the back end, which I would argue the ACIC should have a team of 12 people looking at commonalities between something reported in Victoria versus something reported in Queensland. Some simple things like IP checks. Oh, it's going back to the same device. It could be a commonality. Or simple things like it's the same Western Union account they want you to send money to. Or, you know, let's put together a strike force, and they really, in my view, need to hand out investigational packages to the jurisdictional police with everything done. Search warrants done. Statement of facts for court done. Everything. All they've got to do is look for the arrest now button on the computer and hit it.
You know, in the work we've done in terms of aged care online and ransomware and spams and scams, the elderly people are just frightened of it, and they back out. They just back out. They can't trust the systems anymore, and therefore you've got now isolation. You know, and you start putting this. So we need a proactive approach to this, really, and quickly, because the numbers are just growing.
And without people, people won't participate.
That's right. Yeah, I get ransomware requests for.
Program,
yeah.
They don't have the
yeah.
So I've got a question that's sort of something for Alan and also possibly for Michelle. In terms of this whole smart cities idea, and you know, there's lots of pilots and lots of groups, and it's something that everyone's talking about. I've long wondered if something like the platform that you've been developing, working with a big city like Melbourne, couldn't develop a platform that could then be rolled out to all the poorer councils, especially in regional and remote Australia, because they've obviously not got the ratepayers, they've obviously not got the money to be able to come up with a world's best practice platform. They really need a big city like Melbourne or Sydney or you know, someone to develop a platform for a smart city that can then be deployed to all of the smaller cities. Now, they may only use 50% of the features because they may not have parking meters running down the main street of Broome or Derby yet. But you know what I mean, in a sense that, has that been thought about, or is that something
very
that...
much front of mind, Mark, in terms of this issue of cost, deployability, out of the box. Can it run on my laptop? Yes. Can it run in the cloud? Yes. That's what we're building. Is it adaptable? Is it related to relationships and IoT and all this, blockchain? Yes, all of the above. And we really designed this to say it can run 1 million people or it can run 20 people. And in terms of cost, because it's out of the box and software configured, we're not looking at 5-year projects. We're saying this is what it is. We bend it and shape it and deploy it as the situation needs. So we now invest in how do we get operational scalability as opposed to technical research and things. And so that's the passion I have about this, about building a social fabric, which can be city, could be national, could be a village, could be even a family home, running the home as a domain name with email and video calls to your family. We tend to think of, back to the architecture thing, we need big databases and this and this and this. I think, we know we don't. We want more of a fabric approach, more of a relationship approach and more of a purpose approach and trust in those things. So yes, that's certainly front of mind with what we're trying to do.
I feel an obligation here to do a favour to a mate of mine, Adam Beck, who runs the Smart Cities Council Australia New Zealand, that has actually got a local government group getting together, and the aim of that group is to be able to share this kind of idea so that not everybody is out there inventing the same wheel. So there is an organisation.
Some of them can't afford the wheel.
That's right, but if other organisations are building the wheel and it's the same wheel being used everywhere else, then the price will come down.
Yeah, that's what I say. The Council of Lord Mayors is actually, they say, we want, after we've got our act together as metro cities, the first thing we want to do is go to the 20 next cities, the tier 2 cities. The only problem is these cities need to have the strategic plan in place. Otherwise, it's a bottomless pit. Yeah, and you can do whatever you want to do. But if there's not a vision or there's no strategy at that council, yeah, it doesn't get anywhere. So you need to have first that leadership in place in those councils and the education or whatever you need to do in order to prepare them to get a system like this working, or any other system or project.
Hang on a sec.
Sorry.
I think Michelle's
Oh,
going to come up to you.
Okay. Say I've been in IT a long time, and many prescribe the solution to what they believe their problem is. So they immediately prescribe a problem and then say the solution is prescribed by a database, a server, a portal, blah, 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 and off we go. Whereas I think what we're going through in this decentralisation approach into this social fabric trusted approach is, why not have something out of the box? It may not be right, but let's put innovation as putting seeds out in front of us to say, that's right, that's wrong, let's bend these into shape. And I think that's the problem. A strategy, if you don't know there's an answer to a problem you don't understand, you'll always be in the same place. Sorry. Okay. Thanks.
What was the original question again? Gone back again. I was ready to go.
The solutions that you've rolled.
Thank you. Yes.
To regional ones.
Yes, thank you. I was ready to go with that. So we have a saying in local government, rates, roads, rubbish. So smart cities, the robots, it's the fourth R. And we do recognise that most local governments across Australia don't have the funds and the licence to do some of the things we're very privileged to be able to do here in Melbourne. And so as much as possible we try to create tools and frameworks that other local governments can take and use. To give you a few examples, the Open Innovation Competition I mentioned before, a year ago we did our third one. We created a handbook on how to run these competitions. Anyone in the world can access that document, and we're happy to take Q&A and coach other councils through that. Our census of land use of employment, it's a census of we collect data on every single business in the city once every 2 years. We've got a permanent survey team that literally just rolls through the city. And the platform that's on, we've got Smart Cities and Suburbs funding, and that platform will be available to any local government in Australia from July this year to put their own data onto, to create reports and to look at the data from other councils. The Startup Action Plan that was in this pack I didn't speak to in detail. We co-designed our Startup Action Plan with 400 members of our startup ecosystem here in Melbourne. And the approach we use for that, again, has been now taken by, I think, over 30 councils across Victoria with the help of LaunchVic. So as much as possible, we're trying to create tools that others can use. And then a whole bunch of us met at the RMIT Activator about 2.5 weeks ago. Harvard came to Melbourne. They ran a Smart Cities Accelerator session. There was about 80 people there, about 20 councils represented across Australia. So that was a great forum for us to share ideas. And none of us want to reinvent the wheel. So some of us are part of a global network called City Possible, run by MasterCard, which is all about insight sharing across different local governments. And that was related to this Harvard session. But as much as possible here locally as well, we're trying to share ideas and share what works. So hence, with the 5G testbed we're running, the council said to us at the Harvard thing, you guys are the first ones to do this, you've got to help us understand what's working, what's not, so we can do it better, faster, cheaper. And absolutely, we'll share those insights.
I think Alexander has another one, but while I'm walking over here, the devil makes me say this, but there is a Smart Cities and Suburbs funding coming from the federal government, and I reckon that basically all the work gets done at local government. The federal government will fund it and the states will just get in the way.
Yeah, I just want to say, so like this, Cuba is fully private, right? It's a private enterprise. Yeah, precisely. And so I've been in like 10 ICOs, 2017-18. Now it's a bit more quiet, luckily. But these blockchain smart contract platforms, they're fully private. You can issue tokens. So basically you make your own money, which you then trade for ICOs, so now it's STOs or whatever they call it. And they take over a lot of governance work. Basically, these are governance platforms on blockchains. And so there was this statement, okay, once upon a time there was government in leadership and they figured it all out. The question is, why is this not happening anymore? Is probably because so many people have defected in a way and gone private, and they're building these platforms instead and just nibbling away at more and more functions of traditional, what used to be government. They're liquefying the space themselves, so they don't have to go and ask for any fiat. They just issue some whatever ERC20 token or so and liquefy some space, and through private initiative then just build very nice governance platforms that solve issues like what you want to solve overcoming isolation and loneliness and these things. And you can build platforms for so many applications. It's just fantastic, but government keeps failing. So the point is maybe just should government just get out of the way and just give the space by decriminalizing blockchain entrepreneurs so that they can stay outside of a prison cell for what they do, and just let private industry solve all these problems where government obviously fails.
Mark Zuckerberg for president.
That's what I was just going to say. We'll have a field day with this.
Actually, part of actually working with villages and aged care a bit, the belief to build a decentralised cell mesh system with multiple blockchains, multiple block types and multiple token types is why can't, say, my late mum, say to Mrs Jones up the road, if you look after my cats tomorrow, I'll give you a cake. And the cake is actually the token. You've got interaction. You're actually removing isolation. All the barriers, I'll give you $50, but I can't get to the bank, right, is the other way. So how do you create currencies? And I ask people when they're looking at blockchain, what is the currencies you're dealing with here? Is it blocks, block types, token types? And what's the value system here? How do you agree on a value system of that currency? To me, that's very essential in any smart city. Yeah, and I do honestly see a lot of theoretical blockchain about the block is Bitcoin, and the block is this chain, and it's oh dear.
Yeah, I mean the other business model, of course, is that your data is paying for it. You just the saying is, if you think it's for free, you're the product.
Yeah.
So and there is lots of issues with that. But
Teresa, can I ask a question
yes.
then? Can I just bring us back to some of the things that Paul was saying and some of the things that Nigel was saying, and a disclosure. This is a debate that I'm having with a number of my friends in the technical field who are angry with the government over a range of legislation, including the AA bill, and even before that, the Data Retention Act. And my argument is the problem is that the people who know the solutions don't think there's a problem. The geeks of the world basically still believe that the internet should not be interfered with by government. And interestingly, on the 30th anniversary of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee was quoted as saying it was dysfunctional and we need to do something about it. So my question is, and it comes back to this basic problem that the members of Parliament who are voting on these bills don't even read them, wouldn't have a clue whether they're going to work or not. So how do the people who actually know what the problems are and have the ability to deliver the solutions, why aren't they stepping up?
Well, because they're making a lot of money out of it. Yeah. I mean, look at Mark Zuckerberg. Now he comes out and says, "Oh, I think we should regulate neo-Nazi far-right groups," but 50 people are dead, and that's just the ones accounting from Christchurch, not the incidents that have happened in the US in the last couple of years, which have been equally terrible. So, I think that the reality is there's no driver for them to think about it like that, and unfortunately, it's a case of, well, let's do it and find out, rather than let's think about it. And yes, okay, there's definitely some benefits from doing social and collaborative and all the rest of it, but let's not just let it be the Wild West. I mean, we've learnt in society that we need to have some rules and regulations, and
then you have to think about them and not rush through.
Yeah.
Then you have to think about them. You have to sit down. You have to bring the experts together, and not the experts that belong to your political party. Yeah, you have to be across the board. And then consult with the people who have an understanding of it. The reality is what you were talking about just a minute ago. Yeah, the Facebooks and the Googles are taking over part of governance. Yeah, is that what we really want? Yeah. Is that what we really want? I don't mind that there's lots of other services, but there should be leadership on top that at least have some guidance, on how we build what Nigel was talking about, that they have responsibility for risks. Yeah. Now, the problem is that all of these companies are coming from America, where there is absolutely, a free Wild West sort of situation at the moment. Yeah. So these have totally other values than people, political values even, than people in Australia. We are not afraid that the government does something. In America, they die in their bed if they think the government is doing something. Yeah. So we have the problem that the Americans, are telling us, how to run our business, because they are the companies that are ruling it. But just these haphazard sort of solutions that we are getting from our politicians here in Australia, or in Europe for that matter, but more so in Australia, they don't work. Yeah. So it's up to us to come together to get a government that actually says, let's sit together. Yeah. We did that with the NBN back in 2005. Yeah. Then, there was the Liberal Party and the Labour Party. They both agreed, to actually sit together and talk about what the NBN is all about. We had 40 groups. We had, all sorts of things happening. Yeah? And then suddenly it became party politics and the whole thing collapsed and nobody wants to talk anymore So I think we've got a serious problem. In the meantime, my solution, muddling on. We are muddling on. Do the best we can, because I can't see that politics, even with a new government, I hold my breath. If that suddenly creates a new, can't be worse, but will it be much better? I don't know. Yeah, it will take a long time. If you look at Brexit, if you look at Trump, it takes a long time to get back to a trustworthy situation.
Can I add to that? Sorry, was
whichever way you want.
Yeah?
You go
first.
Okay. I could consider myself a self-funded retiree, been in IT for a seriously long time, dedicated to what I'm doing. I can only claim 43% on tax relief on that. And you go through so many bloody forms, it's not funny. Also in Australia, as directors, we can be in prison for being naughty. In America, i.e. trading while you're bankrupt, that's naughty. You get a red flag for that. In America, you have Chapter 11 and Chapter 13. These guys can go into the red a million miles and still trade. So here we are trying to look for online innovation in Australia where a director could be strung up for trading while bankrupt even though they're trying to help our health or infrastructure. It's not just technology balance, it's the Americans.
We live in a global world.
We live in a global world. So why can't I go into Chapter 11?
Well,
right?
My comment on this is that we might have come out of the jungle. However, we're still human beings, and the marketers of the world have known how to exploit that perfectly, and now they are the richest, most powerful people in the world.
Good question, Laurie. A couple of observations, if I may.
Not bad for an old bloke.
When I joined, speaking of old bloke, when I joined the police back in 1989, I think you're probably 49 then, Laurie. The Commonwealth Public Service genuinely put up contestable policy advice to whoever was in government. And then that flipped, dare I say, really in the Howard times, in the early 2000s, when all of a sudden it came the other way around, where a Minister of came to an agent and said, I need an announceable. And that was the death knell of contestable policy advice that was put up on this is a good idea, to now we just have the public service, and probably the same in the states and territories as well, that is put up to make a minister look good or a governor of the day look good. So I think that's the first problem. The second one is, and it's probably been reflected, is... So what I'm saying is, once upon a time, the public service would put to a minister, we think you should invest in this because of X, Y and Z. It was a good idea based on strategic intelligence or what we think the community needs. Sorry? The evidence, exactly, the evidence base. And it was contestable. They said this. Another part of government might not agree with it, but
You had the discussion.
You had the discussion. It was evidence based. So that's how it used to work. Now, when you look at whether it's Senate estimates, which is a doddle, because it's not what it's designed to do, when you look at now everything that comes out of a department, it's what's the announceable for a minister? How do we protect the minister? What is it that'll make the government of the day look good? And they'll flip on a dime when we get a change of government in, call it 6 to 8 weeks' time. So
there's no discussion anymore. There's no room for rationale.
No accountability.
Well, yeah. So anyway, that's one issue. The next issue